On a freezing Thanksgiving night, deep in the snowy mountains, an elderly widow named Margaret Johnson stood alone on the porch of her small wooden cabin. Snowflakes kept falling hard, covering the entire forest in white. She held a warm cup of cocoa in her hands, expecting nothing more than another quiet holiday by herself. But then, the ground started to vibrate. First lightly, then stronger. Then the sound became unmistakable, the roar of multiple motorcycle engines cutting through the winter silence. Margaret looked up and saw 20 Hells Angels bikers emerging from the darkness. Their headlights slicing through the storm. Their leather jackets were soaked with snow, their boots frozen stiff, and their faces hardened by hours of riding in brutal weather. At the front of the group was a tall, gray-bearded man with sharp eyes and a worn black jacket patched with the Hells Angels emblem. His name was Ryder Coleman, the chapter leader. The men slowed to a stop right in front of her porch. Engines idled. The air was cold, tense, uncertain. Margaret didn't move. Ryder didn't move. For a moment, the only sound was the wind and the low rumble of 20 motorcycles. Ryder finally stepped forward, shaking off the snow on his shoulders. He looked straight at the widow, not with hostility, but with exhaustion. "Ma'am, the storm caught us," he said quietly. "We need shelter, just for the night." Margaret was alone. It was late, and the people standing in front of her were 20 fully patched Hells Angels, a sight that would terrify most. But she didn't flinch. She didn't step back. She simply looked at them, cold, tired, stranded, and then she looked at the storm behind them. After a long pause, Margaret opened the wooden door behind her. The warm light from inside spilled into the snow. "You'd better come in before you freeze to death," she said. The group of bikers exchanged surprised glances. Ryder nodded slowly, almost humbled. And just like that, on Thanksgiving night, an elderly widow sheltered 20 Hells Angels in her tiny cabin, without knowing that this single act of kindness would lead to something no one in that forest could ever imagine. Because by the next morning, more than 1,000 bikers would be on their way to her doorstep. As Margaret held the door open, the 20 frozen bikers stepped inside her small wooden cabin. The sharp cold from the storm followed them in, but the warm yellow light from the fireplace pushed it back immediately. The contrast was almost shocking, from the brutal snow outside to the cozy glow of the cabin within. Ryder Coleman entered last, gently closing the door behind him. Snow melted off his shoulders and onto the wooden floor. He scanned the room carefully. Still alert, still protective of his men, even in exhaustion. The cabin wasn't large, but it felt alive, a crackling fire, shelves filled with old books, a small dining table, and the faint smell of cinnamon tea. Margaret motioned toward the fireplace without hesitation. "Sit down before you catch pneumonia," she said. The bikers looked at one another, unsure how to behave in a place so different from the harsh roads they were used to. But one by one, they removed their gloves, unzipped their heavy leather jackets, and gathered around the fire. Steam rose from their clothes as the heat thawed them out. Ryder remained standing for a moment, watching his men settle in. He wasn't used to relying on strangers, especially not elderly widows in remote cabins. But Margaret's straightforward kindness disarmed him more than he expected. Margaret walked to her small kitchen and filled a kettle. The sound of boiling water and clinking cups brought a strange calm to the room. The men, who were usually loud and rough, sat quietly, almost respectfully. One young biker with frostbitten fingertips murmured, "Ma'am, thank you. We didn't know if we'd make it." Margaret simply nodded, setting cups of hot tea on the table. She didn't ask questions. She didn't act scared. She treated them the same way she would treat any travelers caught in a storm. Ryder finally took a seat near the fire, his eyes softening as he watched Margaret move around the room. He realized this woman had no reason to open her home to them, yet she did. Without hesitation. Outside, the wind continued to howl. Inside, for the first time that night, the bikers felt something they hadn't expected. Safety. Warmth. And the beginning of a story none of them could foresee. As the storm raged outside, Margaret moved into the small kitchen area and began gathering ingredients for a simple meal. The bikers watched her quietly, still warming their hands near the fire. She pulled out potatoes, carrots, onions, and a small container of homemade broth. Nothing fancy. Just the kind of food meant to keep someone alive through a harsh winter night. Ryder Coleman finally stood and approached her. "Ma'am, you don't have to do all that," he said. Margaret didn't even look up. "You're cold. You're hungry. I'm already cooking. Sit if you want, or help if you can." The directness of her words seemed to catch Ryder off guard. He wasn't used to people speaking to him like that, calm, firm, unafraid. After a short pause, he rolled up his sleeves. "I can chop," he said. Two other bikers joined him. One grabbed a cutting board, another rinsed vegetables in the sink. The rest watched, almost amused, seeing their tough brothers quietly assisting an elderly widow in her tiny mountain kitchen. The sound of chopping vegetables filled the room. The rhythm steadied the group, grounding them in a rare sense of normalcy. Margaret stirred the pot, occasionally adding spices while giving short, practical instructions. She didn't treat them like criminals. She didn't treat them like guests, either. She treated them like human beings who simply needed a hot meal. One biker with a rough voice and a face weathered from the road muttered, "Haven't had homemade soup in years." Margaret glanced at him. "Then tonight's a good night to start again." The pot slowly began to simmer, filling the cabin with a comforting aroma. For the first time since the group arrived, the tension eased. Several bikers leaned back in their chairs, shoulders finally dropping as warmth and gratitude settled in. Ryder stood beside Margaret, quietly stirring the pot. In that moment, he wasn't a chapter leader guiding men through a winter storm. He was just a tired traveler helping in a kitchen. And Margaret, without saying much, had managed to make 20 hardened bikers feel something they rarely felt on the road. A sense of belonging, even if it was just for one unpredictable night. While the soup simmered inside the cabin, one of the younger bikers, Kyle, stepped toward the window. He squinted through the frosted glass, trying to see past the wall of snow outside. The storm wasn't slowing down. If anything, it was getting worse. Kyle walked to the door, pulled on his gloves, and asked Margaret softly, "Mind if I check the bikes?" She nodded. "Don't be long. The wind's picking up." The moment he opened the door, a blast of cold air surged into the cabin. Snowflakes whipped across the porch, and the wind howled through the trees like a warning. Kyle braced himself and stepped out into the white chaos. Outside, the motorcycles were barely recognizable. Overnight snow and relentless wind had coated them beneath a thick frozen layer. Headlights, handlebars, exhaust pipes, everything was buried under icy crust. Kyle wiped off a seat with his sleeve, only to discover the leather underneath had already started to stiffen. He tried turning a handlebar. It barely budged. Inside the cabin, Ryder noticed Kyle had been gone longer than expected. He walked outside, the door banging behind him from the wind. Ryder cursed under his breath as he saw the state of the bikes. "This storm's eating them alive," he muttered. Kyle nodded, breath fogging the air. "If the engines freeze solid, we're stuck here longer than planned." Ryder knelt beside one of the front wheels, brushing away snow. He examined the ice building along the brake lines, the suspension, even the chain. He knew bikes better than anything else in his life, and the truth was clear. The storm had the upper hand. Back inside, the warm glow of the cabin contrasted sharply with the brutality outside. Margaret stirred the soup, occasionally glancing toward the window with quiet concern. She didn't know much about motorcycles, but she knew when a storm was dangerous. Ryder and Kyle re-entered the cabin, stamping snow off their boots. The men looked up, waiting for an update. Ryder spoke plainly. "We're not going anywhere tonight." The group fell silent, not from fear, but from the understanding that nature, not man, was in charge. And for the first time in a long while, 20 Hell's Angels were stranded, and entirely dependent on the kindness of an elderly widow. After delivering the bad news to his men, Ryder stepped back outside to clear his head. The storm had calmed slightly, but the wind still carried sharp flakes of snow across the porch. He rubbed his gloved hands together and stared into the dark tree line, listening to the forest groan under the weight of winter. A moment later, the wooden door creaked open behind him. Margaret stepped out slowly, wrapping a thick shawl around her shoulders. She didn't say anything at first. She simply stood beside Ryder, both of them looking out at the icy landscape like two people who understood tiredness in different ways. "You've been on the road a long time," Margaret finally said. Ryder nodded. "Longer than we planned. Storm wasn't on the forecast. We were riding to a Thanksgiving gathering a few states over, but the weather turned fast." Margaret watched the breath from his mouth rise into the cold air. "You must be responsible for all of them." Ryder glanced back at the cabin windows, where the silhouettes of his men moved around the warm interior. "They're my brothers. My job is to get them home safe. I don't like depending on strangers." Margaret offered a faint smile. "Nobody likes depending on strangers. But sometimes we all have to." Ryder leaned against the porch railing, the wood icy beneath his hands. "You didn't even hesitate when we asked for shelter. Most people would have slammed the door, or grabbed a phone to call the police." Margaret sighed, her breath forming clouds in the cold. "I've lived out here for years. My husband used to take in stranded travelers during storms. Said no one should face the mountains alone in winter. After he passed, I just kept doing what he would have done." There was a quiet pause. "Just the wind, just the snow." Ryder studied her expression, steady, calm, without fear. In that moment, he realized why his men felt unexpectedly safe here. Margaret wasn't acting brave, she was simply being who she had always been. "You saved us tonight," Ryder said softly. Margaret shook her head. "No. I just opened a door. What happens after, that's up to you." Ryder lowered his gaze, humbled by her words. Behind them, the cabin glowed with warmth, a stark contrast to the frozen world around them. For the first time in a long while, Ryder felt something unfamiliar on the road. A moment of peace. By early morning, the storm had finally loosened its grip. The wind had calmed, and a pale winter sun pushed through the thick clouds. Margaret stepped outside first, brushing the snow off her porch railing. The entire cabin roof was coated in heavy ice, and a section near the chimney sagged slightly, a clear sign the storm had taken a toll. Ryder followed her out, tightening the strap on his gloves. He looked up at the roof and let out a low whistle. "That section's not safe. If it gets any heavier, it might collapse." Margaret didn't argue. She had known for months the roof needed repairs. But winter had arrived too quickly. Before she could respond, several bikers filed out of the cabin, stretching their stiff muscles. When they saw Ryder inspecting the damage, they immediately understood. "Boss, you want us on it?" one asked. Ryder nodded. "Yeah, grab the tools from the bags. Let's get it done before the next freeze." Margaret blinked in surprise as the group moved with practiced coordination. Within minutes, 2 ladders were set up, and several bikers climbed onto the icy roof. Others shoveled snow away from the edges, clearing a safe workspace. Their heavy boots made dull thuds against the fragile wooden panels. Ryder stayed on the ground initially, directing them with short, precise instructions. These men were used to repairing bikes on the side of highways, camping in storms, and improvising fixes with whatever they had. A damaged cabin roof was just another challenge. One biker secured the sagging beam with a temporary brace while another hammered loose shingles back into place. Someone else reinforced the chimney line with spare metal sheets they carried for emergencies. The steady rhythm of tools echoed through the cold morning. Margaret stood under the porch, clutching her shawl tighter. She had expected to feed these men, maybe offer a place to sleep, but not this. The sight of 20 rough bikers repairing her home left her speechless. Ryder walked over to her. "This roof kept us warm last night. Least we can do is return the favor." Margaret's eyes softened. "You didn't have to." Ryder shrugged. "You didn't have to let us in." Above them, the men continued working as the winter sun glinted off the snow-covered trees. What began as an emergency shelter had quietly turned into something unexpected. A moment of genuine goodwill between strangers who met in the middle of a storm. With the roof stabilized, the bikers didn't slow down. As soon as they climbed off the ladders, several of them grabbed shovels from their gear bags. The storm had dumped so much snow overnight that the walkway to the cabin was completely buried. Even the small path leading to Margaret's woodshed had vanished beneath thick drifts. Ryder stepped forward and pointed. "All right, spread out. Clear everything from the porch to the trees. Let's give her some space to walk." The men moved quickly, forming an informal line, Kyle and two others started at the porch steps, cutting wide trenches through the snow. A few bikers farther out worked on clearing a path big enough for someone to push a wheelbarrow or carry firewood. Their shovels sliced into the snow with steady, repetitive motions. Margaret watched from the porch, stunned by the scene in front of her. At first light, her home had been surrounded by piles of snow taller than her waist. Now, a grid of neat paths was taking shape, each one carved by hands that, just hours earlier, had been frozen stiff from the storm. One biker even cleared the roof of her woodshed, knocking down ice that had begun to form dangerous icicles. Another checked her generator, brushing off snow and wiping down the vents so it wouldn't clog. Ryder walked back and forth between the groups, offering instructions but also pitching in with a shovel whenever needed. His breath clouded in the cold air, and snow clung to his beard. But there was no complaint in his voice. Just focus, determination, and maybe something deeper. Kyle finished a long path and looked up at Margaret. "You won't slip walking out here anymore, ma'am." Margaret pressed her hand to her chest. "You boys are doing more than I ever expected." Ryder leaned on his shovel, catching his breath. "You helped us when no one else would. We're just doing our part." The men continued clearing snow until the entire area around the cabin looked like a small winter courtyard. Clean, open, safe, a place where someone could walk freely, even an elderly widow living alone in the mountains. And as they worked together in the cold morning light, the bond between them all, forged by a single act of kindness, grew stronger than any of them realized. By early afternoon, the cabin grounds were completely cleared, and the bikers returned inside with red cheeks and cold hands. Margaret, who had been preparing since morning, motioned them toward the dining table. It was small, made of worn wood, but she had arranged everything with care: bowls, spoons, warm bread, and the big pot of soup they all helped make the night before. "It's not much," Margaret said quietly, "but it's Thanksgiving, and nobody should spend it hungry." The men didn't move at first. Hell's Angels weren't used to being invited to a holiday meal, especially not in a mountain cabin by a widow they met only hours ago. Ryder stepped forward, nodding to his men. "All right, fellas, let's eat." The bikers removed their gloves, shook the snow from their sleeves, and gathered around the table. Some sat, others stood with their bowls in hand. The fire crackled in the background, filling the room with a steady warmth. Steam rose from the soup as Margaret ladled it out, one bowl at a time. Kyle took the first spoonful and paused. "Ma'am, this is incredible." A few others murmured in agreement. For men who lived on diner food, gas station snacks, and roadside burgers, a homemade meal on a cold holiday felt almost unreal. Ryder waited until everyone else was served before filling his own bowl. He lifted it slightly in Margaret's direction. "Thank you for everything." Margaret simply smiled. "Eat before it gets cold." The room settled into a calm rhythm. The scraping of spoons, occasional small talk, and the soothing heat of the fireplace blended into a peaceful atmosphere. Several bikers exchanged glances, not out of suspicion, but out of quiet gratitude. It had been years since some of them had sat down at a real Thanksgiving table. One man pulled a loaf of bread apart and passed it down the line without being asked. Another poured hot tea for the men on the far end. Their rough edges softened in the safety of that small, warm room. Margaret sat down last, not at the head of the table but off to the side, where she could see all their faces. For a moment, the cabin didn't feel like a widow's lonely home. It felt like a gathering, unexpected, mismatched, but genuine. And though none of them said it aloud, everyone in that room knew this Thanksgiving meal was something they would remember long after the snow melted. The next morning, Margaret woke before the sun. The cabin was quiet, the bikers still asleep on makeshift beds and blankets spread across the living room floor. She stepped outside to breathe the cold morning air, expecting nothing more than a peaceful, silent moment. But instead, she froze. Down the narrow mountain road, far beyond the tree line, a long line of dark shapes stretched across the snow. At first, she squinted, thinking it might be shadows from the forest. But then the low rumble started, faint, distant, but unmistakable. Motorcycles. Not 20. Not 100. But hundreds. Margaret stepped off the porch, gripping the railing for balance as the sound grew louder and louder. The ground trembled lightly beneath her boots. Sunlight finally broke through the trees, revealing what she couldn't believe. A convoy of bikers, stretching farther than she could see. Ryder rushed out moments later, still pulling on his jacket. "What's going on?" Margaret pointed toward the road. "You tell me." Ryder's eyes widened. That's every chapter within 3 states." One of his men stumbled outside behind him, jaw-dropping. "Boss, there's gotta be over 1,000 of him." The rumble intensified as the bikers approached the cabin in organized formation. Engines idled in unison, creating a deep, rolling thunder across the snowy clearing. Leather jackets flashed with patches. Helmets glinted in the pale morning sun. Margaret's porch, once quiet and lonely, now faced an entire army of Harley-Davidsons. Ryder stepped forward, stunned. Word must have gotten out. "About what?" Margaret asked. He looked at her with a seriousness she hadn't yet seen from him. "About you. About last night. Bikers talk, ma'am, and when someone shows kindness to one of us, the whole brotherhood hears it." The first row of the massive group parked their bikes and dismounted. Then the next row, and the next. Snow crunched under thousands of boots as the crowd of bikers formed a semicircle around her cabin. Waiting, respectful, silent. Margaret's heart pounded, not in fear, but in disbelief. She had offered shelter to 20 strangers during a storm. And by dawn, more than 1,000 men had come to honor that simple act. As the massive crowd of bikers settled into position, Ryder stepped forward, his boots crunching through the snow. The men behind him remained quiet, forming a wide arc around the cabin. Their presence was overwhelming, yet strangely respectful. Not a single engine roared. Not a single voice interrupted the stillness of the winter morning. Margaret stood on the porch, her shawl wrapped tight around her shoulders, watching Ryder approach with something folded carefully in his hands. "Ma'am," Ryder began, his voice steady but carrying a weight of emotion. "You opened your home to us with no fear, no hesitation. You gave us warmth, food, and shelter when the storm could have taken us out." He paused, glancing back at the enormous crowd. "And in our world, that means more than you know." Margaret looked at the object he held. It was a black leather jacket, worn, patched, and unmistakably part of the Hells Angels Brotherhood. Ryder held it with both hands, almost ceremonially. "This," he said, "is a chapter jacket. We don't give these to just anyone. But after what you did, the brothers agreed you've earned it." The bikers behind him gave a unified nod, a silent approval. Margaret lifted her hand slightly, overwhelmed. I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ryder replied. "Just know that you're family now. And family doesn't forget." He gently draped the jacket around her shoulders. It looked oversized on her small frame, but it settled like a shield, symbolic, meaningful, deeply respected. Then something extraordinary happened. One by one, bikers removed their helmets and placed them over their hearts. The entire formation, more than 1,000 men, bowed their heads in a moment of quiet tribute. The clearing fell completely silent. Margaret blinked away tears she didn't expect, her breath visible in the cold air. Never in her life had she seen such unity, such loyalty, such gratitude shown so openly. Ryder stepped back, giving her space. "If you ever need anything, anyone in this brotherhood will ride through another storm to get to you. You're not alone out here anymore." Margaret nodded slowly, touched beyond words. As the engines finally roared to life and the bikers prepared to depart, the snowy mountain didn't feel lonely anymore, because one simple act, opening a door on Thanksgiving night, had built a bridge to a family she never knew existed. And from that day on, the widow in the cabin was no longer just Margaret Johnson. She was Mama Margaret, honorary Hells Angel.